Hi, I'm Arthur, and there are so many topics in the 40k universe that I feel deserve to be discussed more than what they get, and then there are topics that I feel are discussed far too much. But then you have topics that are in their own category. There is this category of lore tidbit that I find every now and again that I think is very interesting, but basically it can be summed up as, in a codex entry, usually from 3rd or 4th edition 40k, you will see a snippet of lore that makes absolutely no sense, or is a piece of lore so significant that the idea of it being mentioned as a bit of a cliff note is almost insulting. The War of the False Primarch, the Thyrus, and the topic of which we are discussing today, which is the Howling. I think about the Howling a lot, because there is a lot to think about from the single goddamn paragraph we got about it, but the implications are very interesting. So to give a bit of a background and explore a little bit of what I mean, the entry of which I refer to is in the 3rd edition Black Templars Codex, and it is somewhat malarkey adjacent. It talks about some giant threat to the entirety of mankind that existed in around M34, which ended up controlling over 1,000 star systems through its psychic might, which is crazy. That's actually insane and makes no sense. I'm not actually downplaying it at all. The creature we are talking about is some alien super psychic cyborg by the name of the Cacodominus, which took over the majority of many different systems and planets through its sheer psychic might alone in one specific section of the universe. The Cacodominus was a threat so severe that upon its death, at the hands of the Black Templars no less, the psychic backlash ended up killing billions of individuals, not limited to just people, but astropaths, ships. It's actually alluded to that one of the reasons the Black Templars don't have Psychers anymore is because of their encounter with the Cacodominus, and how when it died, it killed off every psychic in their ranks. Which I feel is going to get a retcon to hell and back, because it's pretty well established that the reason the Black Templars don't have any librarians is their inherent xenophobia against mutants. There isn't much to be said about the Howling. I'm not kidding. Here's the wiki page. Yeah, no, seriously. It's, for some reason, this super significant event that is almost on par with something like the Rangdan Xenocide, yet has a single paragraph of lore in maybe 2 codexes. So why am I making this video if there's so little about it? Aside from speculation, I just like the topic as a whole. Early Warhammer was prone to this, where they would bring up a topic that is pretty loaded with significant information, but never elaborate on it. I mentioned this earlier, but it's actually a lot more common than the examples that I've actually given. So, joke's on you! This video is actually a meta-narrative about seeding ideas for greater stories later in the years, rather than just talking about the Howling. Haha, I tricked you all! Okay, for real though, it's like the Horus Heresy in the early days, where it was more just an idea to give substance to the miniatures fighting at the time, rather than an actual story. But eventually they decided to expand upon it, and some would say they expanded on it way too much. But hey, I'm enjoying the ride. But I think this one occupies a different niche, the Howling, that is. See, with the Horus Heresy done, there's that narrative thread wrapped up and tied into a bow. They said they are going to cover the Scouring, which is the events that followed immediately after the Horus Heresy, which is all about removing the smaller traitor factions throughout the entire various systems of the Imperium and so on and so forth. Which also was mentioned but never truly expanded upon by Games Workshop. So with all that in mind, why do this? Because of how GW makes its writing structure, it's actually super beneficial to do this style of seeding ideas and then expanding upon them later. One, with how GW has their properties set up, a person can drop a single piece of lore and then someone else who is more competent or more apt towards that style of writing can pick it up later and run with it. Unless stated they cannot, like Clone Fulgrim, who was mentioned and then promptly can never be discussed of ever again. But there are instances where people can and do pick it up and end up running with it to the point where it can get some pretty fun lore and some pretty well-written stories. Again, case in point, the many stories of the Horus Heresy. It's very odd, but I think it does work, but it only works as long as they eventually pick it up, or else it's just kind of a big nothing, right? Reason number 2 is it's not ever expanded upon is likely due to the fact that sometimes the imagination of the reader can put forth ideas better than anything that the writer ever could. So leaving things like the Howling kind of blank does help a lot to bolster the creativity of the individuals involved. So say you're reading it, your interpretation is going to be different from mine, just because there's so sparse a detail there, and I'm going to give what I think actually happened and what I think the Caco Dominus probably was later in this video, but I think it is interesting that you and me can have very different ideas. Now, a third and more common point would be that a lot of this is also a safeguard, because if it has only one point of lore that you can reference and look into, then if you need to retcon that piece of lore, then removing it is going to be significantly easier, or removing it and then expanding upon it later. Case in point, the squats being kind of a footnote in the early parts of the Horus Heresy, and so on and so forth, getting wiped out, but then coming back as the Leagues of Votan. I think that's a very interesting and fun way to go about it. Things like the Chaos androids becoming the Necron, and a lot of the older lore for the Horus Heresy becoming the modern lore of the Horus Heresy was very interesting. So you can wipe out stuff and then rewrite it later, but the funny thing about the Caco Dominus and this entire event known as the Howling is it was brought up actually pretty recently with the release of the modern Primaris Marine update sprue for the Black Templars. And how was it brought up? They have the Caco Dominus's goddamn head on a chain in the plastic kit. You can actually just attach it to a dude. This is wacky. You can just put the skull of the Caco Dominus on one of your miniatures as a decoration. I did. I have Black Templars and I got the sprue. It's really nice. But you place the Caco Dominus' skull there, and it counts as a physical representation of a relic that existed in 9th edition 40k. You just have the head of a dude so dangerous he killed trillions on a chain that is just there. It gives a -2 to psychic tests in 9th edition, so that's cool. So, that insanity aside, what could the potential of the Howling even be? Narratively, lore-wise, so on and so forth. It could just remain a cliff note in the history of Warhammer 40k. Or it could become something more, like how they did with the Horus Heresy, and how they are going to do with the Scouring. I personally think that they are going to cover it at some point, or I might just be huffing that grade A copium like I usually do, which is not an uncommon fact if you follow this channel quite a lot. I do like the idea that we don't even know what the Caco Dominus is. It's likely not a one-off. I think that if they were to expand upon it, it's probably going to end up being like a super crave that decided to modify its body to become stronger than it was, which is already pretty insane, because crave, if you don't know about them, are one of the most psychically strong races in the universe, able to control thousands of people if they so choose with a thought. But the idea of a crave who's lived for millions of years, modifying and augmenting their body to the point where they are now on par, if not better, than the strongest of Thousand Sun sorcerers, and even possibly on par with someone like Magnus the Red, that's kind of cool. We'll cover the Crave more in depth soon, because I do want to cover more alien species like that, but, you know, it is interesting to kind of discuss the possibilities here. It is interesting that we do have the thing's skull, so we can infer it was at least vaguely humanoid in shape, about the same size as a Space Marine, and is roughly humanoid. In terms of its build, it also has a third eye and a similar jaw structure, at least on the upper half of things, to that of a human being. So maybe because of that third eye, it also has some kind of navigatorial style abilities that allow it to see into the warp without being damaged too much. Maybe even then, because of that, it can project its psychic influence significantly further than other psychic entities like the Crave. And the idea that this creature is responsible for an entire segment of the galaxy going glowing black is very intriguing to me. And alongside that, in its original lore, it led to the removal of Psykers in the Black Templars, as I mentioned, and that's an interesting concept as well as an interesting prospect to cover. All in all, these specific concepts of unexpanded lore that are sown but never truly grown are very intriguing, I will admit. My personal headcanon is that the Cacodomnus is probably a supercrave of some sort that augmented its body to become beyond an Alpha Plus Psyker. I think that the reason why it was so dangerous is because it had an inherent connection with anybody who had a connection to the warp, thus the third eye. So it could control any amount of Psykers that it saw and use them as kind of beacons that allowed it to further control others, which is why when the Black Templars showed up with Psykers, they ended up getting controlled, and thus the Black Templars learned to distrust Psykers for the rest of their existence. I think that that's a fun way to look at it, and I think that's a reasonable take. But only time will tell if that's correct. I have a few more ideas I want to cover that are in a similar vein like this. I do want to talk about the War of the False Primarch at some point, but I think about the Howling more than most of them, so I wanted to bring that one up first and see if you guys like some of the more conceptual stuff like this. So I wanted to do it as its own video, and I want to do the others as well. But what do you want? What obscure events do you want me to talk about and kind of give my own spin on? What do you think about the Howling as an idea in general? Let me know in the comments, and alongside that, remember to like and subscribe, as it does help the channel immensely, and if you want to help the channel even more, buy one of my silly shirts. I put a lot of effort into these, and so did my artist. So if you could do that, I would very much appreciate that. Special thanks to my channel members for supporting me, and if you want to support me as well as gain access to additional content, then become a channel member today. Thanks again for watching, and the Rangda Xenocide is obviously going to be expanded upon first, but it would be such a flip-off if we covered the Howling first. Yeah, it would be really cool to find out what one of the missing legions was like and why one of the Primarchs is currently in a box somewhere in the Dark Cells of Terra, but we gotta talk about the reason the Black Templars hate nerds, you